all for coming this afternoon. We're delighted to have so many of you here today with us. Welcome to another MediaTech lecture series. This is where we invite lecturers and activists to share their ideas and actions. Before we commence, we would like to show our appreciation to all the participants coming to this event. We'd like to show our appreciation to the exclusive sponsor, MediaTech Foundation, sponsors including Commonwealth Magazine, China Broadcasting, ICRT, IC Broadcasting, Zhonghua Telecom, and Landis Taipei Hotel. We would also like to show our appreciation for our volunteers, too. If you would like to support the foundation, you can simply do so by donations or volunteering your time. We would also like to give a big shout out hello to Mr. Eric Madsen, the Vice President of AIT. Good afternoon. Well, once again, thank you so much for coming to this important presentation. I'm not going to take long to introduce myself. My name is Harry Jones. I'm a broadcaster living here and working in Taipei, Taiwan. When I was approached to moderate this event, I was immediately interested because the Arab-Israeli conflict was something that was discussed by my family, friends, and acquaintances quite often. It's a highly charged issue, whereby political means, it seems, is unable or perhaps unwilling to solve. What makes our speaker today, Dr. Dalit Baum, her talk so very interesting, thought-provoking, and empowering, is how she brings to the table real and effective solutions where we, as individuals, can make peaceful change. At the end of her presentation, we're going to try to leave about 30 minutes for questions. Now, please don't be shy to ask questions. Dr. Dalit Baum has a wealth of knowledge and is very eager to answer questions regarding this issue. Well, I would like to introduce to you now Dr. Dalit Baum of Who Profits, which is an economic boycott group that targets corporations who directly profit from the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome from Israel, Dr. Dalit Baum.
Well, thank you everyone for coming today. I'm really excited about being here. This is my first visit to this part of the world, and I'm really in awe and very curious to learn more about everything around here. Let's see if this works. Fabulous. I want to tell you a little bit today about the kind of work that we've been doing in Israel-Palestine for the last decade, I would say, or since the year 2000. The year 2000 is very important because the year 2000 is also the year where I think many people realized that the peace process, as was happening in the 90s, was ending, was dead. As you saw in the short film, because of the growth of settlements and because of the increased violence, people just let go of the peace process. And they had many different ways of responding to that grief of loss of the peace process. And one of the ways to respond to it was, of course, to organize for peace again, and not just wait for the governments and the leadership to create peace for us. Let's see if this is working. Yes. So here is a map. You see on the right, on your left, on my right. This is a map of the land which is called Israel or Palestine. A very common misconception is that there are two lands. One is called Israel and one is called Palestine. This is not true. It is just one land that has two different names. Okay? So this is the land of Israel, Palestine, or Palestine, Israel. We can fight over that. But it's one land. It's kind of small. It's about, I think, a little bit bigger than half of Taiwan. Israel has about 7 million inhabitants. That's it. The Palestinians add another 4 million in the territories. These are the darker blue areas. The darker blue areas, you see there are 3 separate darker blue areas, were all conquered by Israel in 1967 in a war. And they are still under occupation, so they are totally controlled by the state of Israel. There is no separate, independent Palestine, okay? The one area to the bottom on the left is called Gaza, or the Gaza Strip. I'm sure you've heard about it. It's a tiny little place that holds about 1.5 million people, and currently they are under siege. They are completely surrounded by Israel, under a shipping siege. All supplies by land, by air, by sea are controlled by Israel. They are viewed as an enemy territory by Israel. And then the top area on the north, the Golan Heights, is also occupied, but it's occupied from Syria. And we will not discuss it here today because Palestinians usually don't view it as part of Palestine. It's part of Syria. We will mainly focus on the main area there in the middle, which is also enlarged to the right, which is called the West Bank. So the map on the left says Samaria and Judea. If you look there, Samaria, Jerusalem, Judea. These are the official Israeli names for that part of the land. So Israel has renamed some parts of these lands, and this map is taken from the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, their website. On the right, you see the map of the West Bank, and the West Bank is more politically correct terminology for this area. And you see all the patches in there. There are all these different color patches. The brown patches, they denote Palestinian population centers. The blue patches are where Israelis have moved in, those settlements that you saw in the film. And as you saw, if you noticed in the beginning of the film, there was a quote from the 4th Geneva Convention. And all the members of the UN are signatories to the 4th Geneva Convention, including Israel. And according to the 4th Geneva Convention, an occupying power cannot move their own citizens into the occupied land. It is just illegal. This is not something that you can do. So, and Israel has been doing that. There are about 500,000 settlers living now in the West Bank. And if you look at the map, they are everywhere. You see, the blue patches are everywhere, and there are also light blue patches around the blue patches, which are areas where Palestinians cannot travel. There are very severe restrictions on Palestinian movement in those areas. In some areas, they are totally banned, like all of the area on the right, in the east, totally banned from movement. This is Palestine. So the purpose of this is not really to discourage you. I'm showing you this. You saw that also in the film. This is kind of a short history of the conflict. But it is a story about land. Sometimes it is confused with all sorts of legitimization techniques and stories about ideology and religion. But it is really a story about land. And this is a land where the original native population, which is the Palestinians, were slowly dispossessed and sent out of their own land in several chapters along the years. From the map on the left, which is in 1947, where the yellow area is the Palestinian area, and Jews controlled only 5% of the land, all the way to the map on the right, which is in the end of the war in 1949, where Israel has actually dispossessed a few 100,000 Palestinians that became refugees and moved to live outside the borders of this newly formed Jewish land. This is just one last map. I know you have shown you many maps already, but this is just one last map, and you have some of them in your brochure on your tables. Again, you see the West Bank, and here you see the results of the peace process in the 90s, what is called the Oslo Accords, the agreements between the Palestinians and the Israelis that formed a new entity called the Palestinian Authority. And people now think of the Palestinian Authority as if it was the official representative of the people of Palestine or the state of Palestine to be, yes? You should know that the Palestinian Authority actually has active control only on the areas in tan, pink color on the left, on the right. You see those areas, there are many green areas, but there are also little patches of, I don't know what to call this color, tan, pink. Yes? These are the areas where the Palestinian Authority has control. And even in these areas, the Israeli army can go in and out and take prisoners or attack and so on. So it's a very limited control, actually. All of the green areas, these are the Palestinian population centers. And as you can see, there are many, many little enclaves of these. In fact, there are over 200 such enclaves, and I think 199 of them are smaller than 2 square kilometers. So they're tiny little enclaves. And these areas are called Area B. Area B are special areas where the Palestinian Authority manages civilian lives, like issuing permits and regulations and stuff like that, but the Israelis have total security control, which means the Palestinians cannot even operate a police department there. The rest of the West Bank, the area in white, is in white because it's the color of the rest of the land, the state of Israel. Because this is total Israeli control. Total Israeli control. These are areas where the Palestinians cannot build anything. They cannot do anything, and in most of this area they cannot even be or move freely. This is the map of the West Bank. And because it is a dispute about land, it is important to understand the map when we start talking about this dispute. It's not enough to be engaged in the conversations of ideas and vision and so on. In the end, the land matters. You can see other two pictures here. One is of the road system. There are two separate road systems in the West Bank, one for Israelis and one for Palestinians. Because Israelis live there, what happened was that there is a two-tiered system of economics, of transportation, of legal issues. One for the Israelis and one for the Palestinians. And of course, these are two separate but not equal systems at all. The highways are all for Israeli use only, while the Palestinians have to travel in back roads, dirt roads, around the highways. There are also hundreds of checkpoints and barriers and all sorts of impediments to movement, as you can see in the bottom picture. And as you saw in the film, some areas are totally enclosed in fences and walls. And some villages, for example, are totally locked in, so they have to wait for the soldier will open the fence in the morning if they want the children to go to school. Or if a woman reaches the third trimester of her pregnancy, the recommendation is for her to move to the big city, because if she happens to need medical assistance in the middle of the night, the gate would be closed. So this is just the depressing part. Now let's talk about activism, which I always find more exciting and optimistic. In the year 2000, the Palestinians have launched their second uprising, the second intifada. Very, very desperate intifada. If you remember the reports of suicide bombings and great violence at the time. And we, working within Israel and within the Israeli public opinion, we really wanted to get out in the streets again and bring out some other messages to the street, messages of peace and messages of coexistence and messages of, yes, there is a chance for peace, while as the media was always pumping the idea that that's it, there is no peace, there will not be peace, now we just need to fight. So we organized this new coalition, the Coalition of Women for Peace, which brought together dozens of organizations, feminist organizations, women's organizations, that did all sorts of things. One of the things we did was these giant marches. When I say giant, I mean 5,000, 10,000 people. That's what I mean, okay? Maybe it's not giant in your book. But for us it was big. And we have managed to get so many people, in this case these are women all wearing black, which was what we used to do a lot, women in black, protesting war and calling for a new way of handling the conflict, or saying we don't want to be enemies and so on. But the goal was to reach the Israeli public opinion, and in that we were not very successful. What happened was that the Israeli public opinion mostly disregarded us. We didn't even get to the press. So we were trying to reach people and actually show them what is being done in the West Bank, which is usually 20 minutes from where they live. It's a small, small country. It seems very far, but it's actually very, very small. So this is a photo of another kind of action. I don't know if you can see it with all the light, but the idea was to bring photographs of carnage and destruction that was being done in Gaza into Tel Aviv, into the big Israeli city, the bustling financial center of Tel Aviv, blocking streets with these pictures. Or if you see on the top left picture also, standing in the entrance to the movie theater and showing people those pictures when we are wearing them on our bodies. It was kind of a naive approach, because what we thought that if people just saw it, they will oppose it. That was the idea. It's a very optimistic approach, because the assumption is that people don't know. If they just knew, that will make the whole difference. Another way of trying to reach the media was to just try and do clever, funny little things that the media wouldn't be able to, disregard. So this is just one such an action that we did near Jerusalem. We organized a vigil calling to reinstate the British mandate on Palestine. In other words, to turn the wheels of history back before the wars between Jews and Palestinians, to the colonialist time when Palestine was actually ruled by Great Britain. And our slogan said, no imperialism without an experienced empire. Yes. Or Israelis and Palestinians demand a common enemy. It's one thing that can bring us together, is to fight a common enemy. This is another such, I think, very radical action. In this case, the Israelis were attacking Gaza, as they do once in a while. Every few months there is an attack on the people of Gaza. And this was back in 2005 already. And what we did, a group of activists, we went all the way to the border. There was a parking lot of tanks that was not in use at the moment. And we took over the tanks. And we staged a demonstration on the tanks, and we spilled some red paint on the tanks and put pictures of the casualties of that attack inside the tanks. So when the soldiers will come and come to the machines, they will see the pictures. Another idea that says that if the soldiers just saw the pictures, they will understand that this is wrong. Bringing these images in by staging them in street theater. So when Israel was taking thousands of prisoners in order to finish this rebellion, 2003, 2004, were years where Israel took over the West Bank again in force and went into the big cities and took thousands of prisoners and marched them in the hills to big stockades of prisoner camps. So we tried to stage that inside the Israeli cities and show Israelis these images that they didn't want to see. Or after the massacre of Jenin, where Israel went into one of the Palestinian towns that was one of the hearts of Palestinian resistance and just destroyed the entire city center with bulldozers, destroying houses upon their inhabitants, killing innocent civilians in the process. After the massacre of Jenin, we tried to show blood on our hands. We even went out in the middle of the night and we painted the fountains of the city in red. We tried to stage these biblical symbolic actions. But actually, I want to say that all of these actions, even though they were a lot of fun, we really had a lot of fun, didn't help much. It's a sad story. The situation in Israel-Palestine in the last decade has been going from bad to worse. And I want to tell you more about the movement that started in 2003 with the construction of this wall, the same wall you saw in the film, the separation wall, the apartheid wall, the fence, or whatever people want to call it. There is a lot of dispute over its name. But there is no dispute over the map. The map is atrocious. and the International Court of Justice in The Hague in 2004, in July 2004, has declared this wall illegal because it is built on occupied land, because it separates Palestinians from Palestinians, if you look at the map, because it affects 10% of the West Bank and annexes most of it into Israel. Because people who are stuck in one of those enclaves will have to move out. Their livelihood is gone. Because people who are stuck on the wrong side of the fence have to have permits to live in their own homes. When the fence and the wall were starting to be built, people didn't know about the map. We didn't have any maps. We didn't know where it is going to be built. Israelis wanted this wall because they wanted a border, because they wanted to stop the suicide bombings. They had very good reasons to want this wall. But they didn't know where this wall was going to be built. And when they built the wall, they built it for other reasons. They built it with such impunity, so they could just take over more and more land and water resources and so on. So when they started building the wall, this is only then that we started understanding what this wall is all about. And people started organizing along the route of the wall, in the little villages, like the people you saw in the film. In the little villages where they suddenly saw their trees being cut down. And many of these villages were agricultural villages that depend for their livelihood on the olive trees. They made olive oil from these olive trees. So they started organizing locally. And I'll start with the story of one of these places. I don't know if you can see it here in the map on the right. I promised no more maps, but I was lying. So I'm sorry. On the right you see there is route number 5, and on top of it there is this yellow dot which is called Mascha, just under the name Etz Ephraim. I don't know if you can see it. I cannot. Oh, I can. This is something fun. Let's see if I can do it. Here! High tech, I love that. So it works. So this is a village of Mascha. All these yellow dots are Palestinian villages. All the blue areas, as usual, are Israeli settlements, built on the Palestinian land, many times privately owned land that was just taken over. And the blue line is the wall. This is like a Möbius strip. I don't know if any of you knows of Möbius strips in mathematics. They have only one side. Or a fractal, you know. So this is the village of Mascha. And the village of Mascha has staged very creative, very radical, and very unprecedented kind of action. They made a camp just next to the construction site. You can see how this is a bulldozer building the wall, taking down the trees, and the camp is just next to it. And people would just live in the camp, eat and drink and sleep and talk in the camp. That is all. Nothing else. No paint and no demonstrations. This was a radical action because they invited to this camp everybody. Thousands of people came to this camp from all around the world. The camp was there for 4 months, all throughout the construction. And when the construction moved, they moved with the construction and stayed next to the construction. What was radical about it was that they also invited Israelis, because the only way to oppose a separation wall is by being together. And in that camp, they planted the seed for a new movement. In a way, you can say that this separation wall has actually brought us together. This is the last day of the camp. The camp was taken down because they finished the construction. And this is the last day where activists from Israel and from all around the world arrived to the camp in order to be arrested, symbolically, to show their solidarity with the camp. And this is where the last day took place, next to this person's house. His name is Abu Amer, Hani Abu Amer, and am I right? Amer Abu Ali, Abu Hani. Sorry, I'm a little bit excited, so that's why I forget the name. But this is where it was, just next to his house, and therefore the Israeli army has decided to punish him for letting the camp be on his land in front of his house. And they have surrounded his house totally. His house is totally surrounded until today. 3 sides are surrounded by a fence, This is already a settlement. This is an Israeli house, and there is a fence between the two houses. And between him and his village, between him and his own village of Masra, they have erected the wall. This is like a small part of a wall, less than this room, maybe half of this auditorium. Private wall for this house. And a private little gate here that he can open only with permission and cross to visit the village and go to school or to visit friends. This is a kind of revenge. One of these enclaves, I told you that there were about 200 such little enclaves. This is one of them. The more you go into the details of the occupation, the more you see the cruelty of it. This is our escalation. You know, whenever the occupation escalates, we also need to escalate. So our escalation was to come there and paint on the wall with the children of the family. But this little place of Masra has started a huge movement. And the movement has grown. First it spread to many of the villages around along the route of the wall. And some of them gained a lot of successes. Like one village, Budrus, has managed to regain some of its land back because they appealed to the Israeli Supreme Court. And they were so persistent in their demonstrations, and they got so much publicity in the Israeli media that they have managed to win that lawsuit and win some of their land back. And when they won, many of the other villages wanted in too. They also wanted to do the same. The principles of this new movement were all about nonviolence, strict nonviolence, Gandhian nonviolence. In fact, they have invited Arun Gandhi, the grandson of the Mahatma, to come to Palestine and start encouraging people to join these tactics. Another principle was that this is a joint movement. It is a global movement, but it's also a joint movement, Palestinian-Israeli, but it's also a Palestinian movement in a way that it is Palestinian-led. And the leadership is Palestinian, and the decisions are Palestinians. And me, as an Israeli, I don't go to the West Bank and do whatever I want to do, because if I did that, I would be a settler and not a solidarity activist. These are some of the weird encounters that we had in these small villages between the Israeli activists, who are usually young, anarchist, queer, radicals, and the local women. In this case, these are women demonstrations, women of the village who are the more respectable organizers, older, very traditional usually in the small villages. Interesting encounters. And the demonstrations. And these demonstrations started in 2003, but they are continuing to this very day. Yesterday were, I think, 5 different such demonstrations against the wall. All of them are non-violent demonstrations, joint demonstrations. People just go out and march to the wall, march to the fence, or march to the checkpoint together. The army is always there waiting. That's all. That's what people do. And I have to tell that yesterday in one of these demonstrations in Nabi Salah, in one of those villages, a person was shot in the head with a tear gas canister, and he's very critically injured. And he's in the hospital now. I don't know if he will survive it. I hope he does. A lot of violence in these demonstrations from the side of the Israeli military, because demonstrations are not legal in the occupied territories. No demonstration is legal. There is no right to organize at all. This is not a democracy. So arrests, but also a lot of tear gas and a lot of special weird gases that have different effects, and we usually talk about them afterwards and say, hey, this is what happened, this is what happened. Rubber-coated bullets that can kill, plastic bullets, pepper bullets, sponge bullets, the skunk, which is a kind of a spray machine that sprays very foul-smelling materials. You cannot really stand it. This is the worst. This is really terrible. I mean, maybe being shot is worse, but still, this is really bad. And the scream is a sound machine that people cannot hear. It makes people, you know, just run away because it can really destroy your body. And live fire, actual live fire that the army uses whenever there are no Israelis around, but sometimes when there are Israelis around, they are 3 Israelis who were injured by live bullets. There are about 20 demonstrators who were killed in these demonstrations, and thousands that were injured. I'm just showing you some more of these images. But none of these images was taken by me. When I go to a demonstration, this is usually the pictures I take. You see the donkey? Okay. So that's because when they start shooting, I don't care what they're shooting. It all sounds bad to me. I start running. You know, I don't take pictures. I don't stop there to record and document the violence. I just run, and I run for my life. And when I stop running, I usually find myself in such a place. And then I take a picture, waiting for things to calm down. So that's me. Another important place for us to hear about is Bil'in. It's another village, a village that gained a lot of prominence in this movement because of their persistence. In Bil'in, every Friday there is a demonstration against the wall and the annexation of their land by the wall. Every Friday. It's been now over 6 years. Every Friday. And these Friday demonstrations are always very creative. You can see there, these are people who locked themselves to the fence. This is an olive tree demonstration, that the demonstration itself is planting olive trees. Or people who put themselves in a cage and then wait for the army to come and free them. So, you know, the symbolics of having the army free you. This is a demonstration they did along the lines of the film Avatar. I don't know if you saw it. So trying to teach people, you know, the film Avatar is all about an indigenous population fighting for its freedom. So people just dressed up as Avatar and marched. And can you imagine wearing this makeup over your body and then marching towards the army who is going to shoot you? It's not that they maybe are going to shoot you. They are going to shoot you. They always do that. Think about the audacity of it. Here is on the left, you see also reflecting your message with mirrors on the bodies of the soldiers. So the slogan will be written on their bodies. Okay. This is Bil'in. You can go online and look for more pictures and more ideas and ask yourself, it's been Friday. What did they do yesterday? Because every Friday they do something. And they also gained a big victory. They got the Israeli Supreme Court to rule that the construction of the wall in their area was also illegal, because it was built on private land and it was built in such a way just to secure the real estate interests of some developers that wanted to take their land. This is how it was built. So they won in court, but they still didn't get their land back because the army has not moved the fence. So they keep demonstrating. This is one of the things they did. They once collected some of all the grenades and the rockets that were fired at non-violent demonstrators. They just collected them and made an art exhibition and all sorts of art with these used weapons. The principles of non-violence and shared movement, joint movement, have spread, I think, and become very, very dominant today in the Palestinian mind frame. Of course, there are other parties who want to use other tools, but this stream of thought has gained a lot of prominence because of the ways in which this kind of activism gains the Palestinians more legitimacy internationally, more allies, and more legitimacy in Israel and allies. And I think that many of my friends, the Israeli activists, have completely changed, including myself, have completely changed the way we view where we live because of that. Because if we used to think of our movement as an Israeli movement that tries to change Israeli policies in order to stop killing and dispossessing the others, the Palestinians, in order to stop being such a militaristic country which is ruled by generals and trying to become more, less militaristic and more, I don't know, civil. Now we view ourselves as part of a joint Israeli-Palestinian movement, and we see our land as the land of Israel-Palestine, and we care about the future of this entire land. And in fact, we have come to oppose any kind of wall on this small land, trying to separate people according to their ethnicity. These are some people from the village of Bil'in. In fact, they are all members of the same family. Bassem Abu Rahme on the left, the top left, was killed in one of these demonstrations while he was talking to the soldiers, and he was telling them, don't shoot, don't shoot. They shot him in the chest with a tear gas canister, fast tear gas canister that killed him almost instantaneously. You can see the picture, it's online. In fact, you can actually watch his death on YouTube, which is horrifying, but it is important. Below Bassem, you see his sister, Jawahir Abu Rahme. A year and a half after he was killed, she was killed too in one of these demonstrations. She was killed by asphyxiation. She choked to death on the tear gas. On the right to her, you see Ashraf Abu Rahme. You see him in the green t-shirt, and you see him standing with his back to us. And he's under arrest, and he's held by two soldiers. This is an officer, and this is a soldier. And this scene was caught on tape, on video, and put online. And it caused a lot of uproar around the world and in Israel. Because what you can clearly see in this video is how this officer is telling the soldier to shoot him. And the soldier shoots him in the leg. He's alive, thank God. But he was shot in the leg by the soldier, like that, as a kind of a staged execution. And this was caught on tape. Because it was caught on tape, the officer involved is now facing charges, military charges, because it's all documented. And because it was caught on tape, and because the officer is facing these charges, the army has arrested Ashraf, who is a photographer and a reporter, and put him in jail for some bogus charges, as a kind of revenge, because they can. He's also the brother of Bassem and Jawahir of Bil'in, same village. A cousin of them, Abdallah, has spent a long time in prison, and that will be my last story of Bil'in, because he's one of the main organizers of the demonstrations in Bil'in and one of the main speakers for nonviolence. And when the soldiers now want to stop these demonstrations, this is their new technique. They come and they arrest the organizers. But they have to arrest them for something. So what they usually do is try and prove that they are involved in violence, even though these are non-violent organizers and speak out very publicly against violence. So I've been to Abdallah's trial. This is, you see him in a prison uniform here. He is held in a military prison. The Israeli military control this area. And he had a military trial with an Israeli soldier as a judge. This is the way it is done in the occupied territories. And in order to convict him of telling people to throw stones, which is what they charged him with, they have arrested children, teenagers of the village in the middle of the night, 2 or 3 a.m. in the middle of the night, at gunpoint, took them to the military prison where they were held for a week. I don't know in what conditions, but usually not good conditions. Held there not charged with anything, but just making them prepare to come to court a week later and tell the court, testify against him, point at him and say, he told us to throw stones. And I sat in court and saw how 3 children, 3 boys, were brought to the court, all shackled, 13-year-old, 14-year-old, and tried to avoid saying it. Because, of course, he didn't tell them to throw stones. Maybe they throw stones, but they don't need anyone to tell them to throw stones. So I know that many regimes around the world use these techniques. I just know that for many years growing up in Israel, I didn't know that this was happening in my own country. I was sheltered from that because I had the privilege of my ethnicity. I am Jewish. I am not Palestinian. So I didn't know that this is the situation just a few minutes from where I live for others. And coming to this court and sitting there is something that I try and do once in a while because it's so easy to forget where I live. I'm jumping ahead a little bit. The same ideas of nonviolence and joint organizing and global solidarity have spread into other initiatives. And you've heard, I'm sure, of some of them, like the flotilla. If some of you have heard about the flotilla, the ship that go to the Gaza Strip in order to break the siege non-violently. Another such initiative that came out of the same movement is called BDS, Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions. BDS is the abbreviation. This is a call that came in the anniversary of the ruling of the International Court of Justice about the wall. That was in July 2005, 1 year after the ruling of the ICJ about the illegality of the wall. Palestinian organizations came together. Over 170 different Palestinian NGOs came together and signed a call, the unified call for BDS. It is a call upon people of conscience around the world. In other words, you and I. Calling us to use the tools of boycotts, divestments, and sanctions on Israel until it complies with international law and international principles of human rights. The different elements of the call actually call for three specific things. One is the end of the occupation. The other one is equality. Equality, complete equality for Palestinians, also the Palestinians living inside Israel. Because 20% of the population of the state of Israel, not the occupied territories, are Palestinians that never left. Not everybody was made to leave, some were left behind. So full equality for Palestinians, that's the second demand. The third demand is return, the right of return of all Palestinian refugees to their lands. This is, of course, the lowest common denominator of the Palestinian demands, because it was signed by organizations that are very different from each other, from the women's organizations, the youth organizations, the socialist organizations, the communist organizations, the Islamist and religious organizations. All of them signed this call. The unions, all of them are signed to this call. And with this call, it created a kind of a dilemma for us as an Israeli organization. I cannot boycott Israel. I'm an Israeli. But what is our role in this movement? So I want to just give you two examples of the things that we can do and we have done. One goes back to Bil'in. This is another map. It shows you that I'm still lying and showing you more maps. This is the village of Bil'in. This is a wall that took away so much of Bil'in's land. And so if we are willing to go to Bil'in every week and risk our lives in order to protest against this wall and the injustice of this wall, we might be also willing to investigate a little further and see why are they building that wall there. You know, maybe we can do some Googling. And what we found out is that the wall is built in order to protect some future construction. So there are some developers that are going to gain a lot of money by building housing units on this land, because the land is very cheap, because it's not theirs, because it's stolen. And so they are going to sell these very cheap apartments for people coming from the city who need cheap housing. And everybody is going to make a lot of money, everybody but the Palestinians who lost their livelihood. So the question is, who is building those settlements? And when looking into that, we found that one of the developers was a Canadian firm in Canada. So we went to courts in Canada and sued them in Canada, because you cannot do that. Settlements are illegal by international law. Another one of the developers we found was an Israeli tycoon who deals in diamonds. In fact, he was he's the first person who broke the De Beers monopoly on diamond mining in Africa. Long and sordid story. So this guy, his name is Lev Levayev, has a big diamond store in New York, and this is a demonstration outside his store. We are a global movement. If he has business in New York, people will demonstrate against his business in New York. But his business in Israel is very small. The world is very big. So when it comes to economic interest, we might have better tools to influence them than we have in influencing other type of interests, like ideological interest or religious interest or political interest. Economic interests are easier to handle. So in this case, he gained so much publicity, bad publicity, for his involvement in this illegal business in the territories, building settlements on Bil'in's land, And this was in a bad time for business. There was a financial crisis, and the housing prices went down, and he lost much of the cost of the worth of his assets in Russia. He has a lot of assets in Russia. And he lost some investors because some big investment firms in Europe have decided to divest from his company over his involvement in illegal business. All of that put together has made him come out with a public statement saying he will not build in the settlements. And that was a huge success, because how could we do that before? We didn't have any power of doing that before. And in this case, it was just a small group of people who publicized his involvement and then were tenacious enough to stand outside his store and, I don't know, sing Christmas carols. That's what they did, actually. They sang Christmas carols last year. And so that was brought us to the idea of putting together a database of corporations that are directly involved in the occupation. Directly involved. Thank you. I haven't seen you. I was looking at him. Directly involved in such illegal business, directly involved in settlement construction, directly involved in the repression of demonstrations and things like that, in building the wall. And let me just flip ahead a little bit because of the little note here saying that I don't have much time. And tell you that what we try to do is look at the cost of the occupation. And there are many researchers that looked into the cost of the occupation and also can show how the occupation is very costly to the state of Israel. The wall is very costly, the settlements are very costly, building all these roads is very costly. And instead of looking at it as cost, flipping it and looking at it as profit. Because all of this money, it comes out of the public money, yes, our tax monies or our state money, but it goes into people's pockets. For some people, this is profit. And the idea is that the profit is not divided equally. There are those who have a financial stake in it. And these people usually are the people who have a closer relationship with decision makers in Israel. And some political clout, because this is how capitalism works, you know. People with a lot of money usually have some political power, especially in Israel today. That was the idea. The idea is that we as civil society, we need to understand these economic interests better in order to influence them. And we might have the tools to influence them, because we have a global movement who is outraged about the atrocities in Palestine. And Israel-Palestine is a very small country. So it's small business and it's small money for these tycoons. So maybe it will be worthwhile for them to pull out of this occupation business and not be considered as very controversial around the world. These are some of these tycoons. And this is Lev Levayev. Let's see if it works. Yes, this is Lev Levayev. These two here are the Ofer brothers. One of them just passed away recently, but a few months ago they signed a petition calling Israel to return to the negotiation table with the Palestinians and go back to some peace process. And this was a breakthrough because none of the business community in Israel has supported anything like that in almost 17, 18 years. And when they were interviewed about why did you sign that letter, they said, because we don't want to be isolated like South Africa. So the fear of BDS, the idea that Israel can be isolated is already being effective. And Israel can be very easily isolated because it's, as I said, a very small country, but also a very exposed globally. The market in Israel is very much globalized and very much exposed. It's very much dependent on outside resources, unlike South Africa, by the way. And it's also very centralized. It's a small group of tycoons that hold most of the market. So it's a small number of people whose interest we need to influence. It is doable. It's not just doable, it is being done. And we put together a database. It's online on a website, whoprofits.org, which is a project of the Coalition of Women for Peace. Women, peace, doing financial research. Kind of surprising, you know, not what you expect of a women's peace organization, but yes. And if you go there, you see we have over 500 companies up on the database. We have companies that exploit Palestinian workers in the settlements because they can use the Palestinian labor very cheaply there. We have companies that exploit the Palestinian environment because it's outside of the state of Israel's borders, so people can dump their waste there very cheaply and with impunity. They can pollute the air, the water, and there isn't much regulation for them to worry about. And it's very close. It's going from Israel to the occupied territories. You just get on the highway and you're there in 20 minutes. You don't have to go and dump your wastes in some other continent. It's just there. We have a place where they also exploit natural resources. You know, when we think about the history of colonialism, we know that colonialists always take the natural resources, the gold, the oil, the diamonds. There is nothing like that in Palestine. But whatever there is in Palestine, the Israelis are taking for their own benefit. And what are these things? Land, water. The West Bank is very water rich, and all of that water is taken for the Israelis. Very little of it is left to the Palestinians. And then anything else that works. For example, in this case, this is a stone quarry. So quarrying stones for the construction industry and bringing them back into Israel. This is also illegal by the Fourth Geneva Convention. You're not allowed to take the non-renewable natural resources from the occupied area and use them for your own economy. It is illegal. It is called pillage. Yes, of course. These are some of the successes we've had. I don't want to continue talking for too long because our time is almost up. Maybe it's up already, I know. But if you want, during the Q&A, I can tell you more about it. These are all global corporations that have pulled out or announced that they will pull out of their settlement businesses due to public pressure. So this is not something that will be successful. This is already being successful. And many times when the global corporations step out, others do not want to come in their place. And when they want to sell their business in Israel, Palestine, they have to sell it to some local Israeli firm because no transnationals want in, because they know that this is costly. We are being already very successful. And the last example that I wanted to tell you about is our flagship of the movement. It's called Veolia. It's a French multinational. It's a company that specializes in privatizing public business. It has some business here in Taiwan, I've checked. They operate waste-to-energy plants, and they do some waste collection, both dry and wet waste in Taiwan. They do waste collection also in the West Bank. If I go forward, they do that in the settlements. They own a landfill where Israel dumps its waste. So Israel puts its waste on trucks and travels all the way to the West Bank and dumps its waste there, which is, as I said, illegal by international law. They also operate buses. They operate buses in the West Bank, which are segregated buses. Buses that, if you look at the map, go by the Israeli and Palestinian towns, but stop only for the settlers. These are one of these highways, this highway number 443. Palestinians cannot even get near the highway, even though it was built on their own lands. They are not allowed to use this highway. So these buses are, again, a violation of international law and common decency. We've had huge success in this campaign around the world. People have organized in municipalities and cities all around the world and declared their city Veolia free, sending a message to the company that it will not be welcome in our city. We will not accept a contract to you to collect our waste or operate our buses locally. And then they also lost contracts that were not renewed in different places just because of their involvement in the occupation. It is estimated that they have lost over 13 billion euro in contracts around the world, including the operation of the underground in Stockholm and in Bordeaux, France. This is a huge victory, and the company is running. It is trying to step out of its occupation business. It's also in very huge financial troubles. So this is the kind of work that we're doing, and this is just one example. But I wanted to tell you about this example because this company has business over here. And it might be a good idea to educate people over here about this global campaign, so maybe people can join it. This is my last slide. I just wanted to put together some resources for you for further reading. You can see here our database, whoprofits.org, our organization, the Coalition of Women for Peace. These 3 websites give more information and pictures and stories about the anti-war movement and the different demonstrations against the wall and what is happening every week. All the time, new information, new videos. And in the end, these are the 2 websites that will give you some information about this economic activism campaign, about the BDS movement and the different corporations and how they are being challenged around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Dilip-Bohm, for your very passionate and insightful presentation. Let's open up the floor for questions. Now, if you notice, right below your microphone, there's a panel with a button, and you can use that microphone to ask your question.
Hello, I've got a question here.
We don't see you. Where are you? Up there. Okay, the gentleman over there. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for your very inspiring speech. My name is Stephen Liu, a graduate student in Taipei. I am very pleased to learn that Israeli activists like you are demanding that the Israeli government stop committing atrocities to the Palestinians. I very much appreciate your effort. However, I still have 2 questions. First, how on earth does the Israeli government persuade or talk over the international community to believe that what they are doing is right? How can their actions be justified? Indeed, Israel's got a lot of strong support from powerful countries such as the United States and a bunch of Western countries, and many thanks to the influential Jewish communities across the world. However, apart from this, are there any other arguments the Israeli government make to justify its means, to justify its atrocities? And my second question is about Palestinians' latest joining to the UNESCO. Some people are cheerful about this successful movement. However, some people worry that the Palestinians would be further suppressed or even bullied by the Israeli armed forces, because many parts of Palestinian communities are still tightly controlled by Israeli armies. So if the Israeli government is pissed off by these kinds of movements, they can simply impose economic or other kinds of sanctions. So what's your view toward the recent development happening in the United Nations? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much for your both excellent questions. Thank you. The first one about the international support, you're absolutely right. I don't know how they can justify it. Even though I was part of that same mindset for so many years of my own life. I have grew up in Israel. I've received much of the indoctrination, the Zionist indoctrination. Much of it revolves around a feeling of being persecuted. I think that we study the Jewish history as a history of persecution, and we view the world as all trying to destroy us in some way. So many atrocities are justified in the name of survival. I do not think it is justified, and I do not think this is a just view of the situation. But this is how we learn it in school, and this is how we're trained to think about it. So much so that people who are protesting, as you saw, for some joint democratic future, are many times portrayed as people who want to destroy Israel. Even though these are non-violent, peaceful people, they are portrayed as people who want to destroy Israel, because what they are aiming to destroy, in a way, is the present configuration of ethnic privilege of one group over another. And that is portrayed as destroying the chance of survival of the Jewish people. This is how it is actually being seen by the Israeli general public. As for international support, Israel is totally dependent on international support, economically, diplomatically, and psychologically. Totally dependent. I know that many times this is attributed to the Jewish lobby or the political power of Jews, but I think this is overrated. This is really overrated. And it even has some traces of old historical anti-Semitism that viewed Jews as all-powerful. Jews in the United States constitute no more than 5% of the population. It's a tiny minority. On the other hand, the United States have been involved in supporting dictatorships all around the world, not just Israel, many other problematic regimes, even in the Middle East, as we know now, just looking at the news and seeing those regimes topple down. I think in many ways, the US supports Israel unconditionally and gives it this total impunity for its own reasons and for its own interests, as it views it, very cynically. One of them would be also a way to support its own military-industrial complex, because the US supplies Israel with about $3 billion a year in military aid. And this military aid, most of it stays in the US. It never reaches Israel. The guns go to Israel. The money stays in the US and goes straight to the weapons manufacturers, to Northrop Grumman and Raytheon and Boeing, the big weapons manufacturers. So in a way, this is a subsidy, a very, very safe, stable subsidy from the US government to its own military-industrial complex. With the European countries, everybody always mentions that their support of Israel has to do with some sense of historical guilt over the Holocaust and the Jewish genocide during World War II. I don't think this can really justify so much for so long, or such atrocities done to other people. In the end, I cannot speak for these governments, but I can say that as civil society, we can stop waiting for the leadership and the diplomats to make a difference. And we can do whatever we can. And whatever we can do as citizens, as taxpayers, as consumers. We can choose to buy things or not buy things and do it cleverly and organize around it, not just individually. Individual shopping choices have no political power whatsoever. As investors, you know, where do we put our pension monies? Where do we invest our monies? Where do we don't do that? And remember the lessons from the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and how it took many years, but in the end, this outside pressure by civil society has had a huge effect. Oh, and there was, of course, the second question. I apologize. The UN bid by the Palestinian Authority. You asked about that and about the acceptance of the Palestinian Authority into UNESCO and what to do with that. I want to remind people that there was already a UN resolution separating between a Jewish state and a Palestinian state back in 1947. So there is UN recognition of a Palestinian state on a much different map than today, much bigger, gives the Palestinians much more than they would have today. So the UN bid is very much a part of this movement I told you about, of using tools of nonviolence in order to raise the issue of Palestine in the international arena. It's a form of action, it's a form of protest in the international arena, that's all. And the Palestinian Authority does not control almost any of the West Bank. I mean, you remember the map with the little pink dots. That's it. So there is no state of Palestine. Everything is under total Israeli control, everything but the Gaza Strip, which is totally surrounded and under very, very violent siege. So what is the meaning of being accepted to UNESCO? It's a symbolic meaning. And it's symbolic meaning that raises to the consciousness of people around the world the idea that there is no Palestine and that Palestine is still under occupation after all these years. And in that regard, I think it is a very powerful and useful action because, as you saw on the maps, soon there will be nothing to talk about. This is a kind of a last cry or last try out of the Palestinian Authority to call for an independent Palestinian state. Some people claim it's even a too late kind of cry because of the map, because of what you saw about the settlements and the war.
How about this gentleman over here? Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Baum. I just have two short questions. Number one, Palestinians and Israelis live in the same land. Do they use the same currency, post stamps? How do they have everyday life together? Number two, you mentioned that one of the developer was sued in Canada. I wonder if there is any verdict. Thank you.
Israel and Palestine are not two states that are superimposed upon each other. Israelis and Palestinians live in the land, but there is only one state. Israel is the state. There is no state of Palestine. There is no currency of Palestine. They don't make stamps. They don't have a state. So in a way they use the Israeli currency, which means that Israel controls the currency. And one of the things we tried to do in our research project is also look into banks and banking and financial services and how they operate in order to strangle Palestinian economy. And it's very easy for them to do that because all the transactions in Palestine are done with either the Israeli currency or the Jordanian currency, and mostly the Israeli currency. Israel controls all the import and export into the Palestinian Authority. So they collect all the taxes for the Palestinian Authority. And they hold them as collateral. So if they don't like something, they can not pass the taxes to the Palestinian Authority that needs it for their salary and their operation. So it is done every few months. You can read in the news that Israel is withholding the tax monies. They do that even, they control all of the electricity supply into the Palestinian area, all the water supply, all the utilities. Gas, petrol. They control all of the main staple foods, rice, flour, salt. They control the market. They control it in such a way that Israeli producers will not be challenged by competition from the Palestinian producers because, of course, in a cheaper market, it is cheaper to produce goods and it's easier to compete. So they actually, we know of cases, for example, when settlers who grow dates, palm dates in the Jordan Valley, have used their connections with the Israeli army in order to make it so that the Palestinians who grow dates will not get any water for their trees unless they agree to sell the fruit through the same marketing agent. And the idea is that if the fruit is sold through the same marketing agent in Europe when it goes to export, then the Europeans who do not usually want to buy settlement products because they are very much aware of the problematics of settlements will think that some of these dates are Palestinian-grown dates, and it's useful for the export of the settlers. So they could actually shut off the water. And we have many such cases. We know, for example, that the price of electricity supplied by the Israeli electricity company to Palestinian industry is 3 times more than the price to the Israeli industry. And why? Because this is not a free market, because it is a highly politicized market, and it has been used for many years in order to stifle down or de-develop the Palestinian economy. So it's all controlled by Israel. There is no independent currency. As for the lawsuits, the reason why I didn't tell you what happened in Canada is because it wasn't so good. You know, when I was trying to encourage you and to be optimistic, we lost that case. We lost that case in Canada against the Canadian developers who built on that land. But we didn't lose it altogether. The court did discuss it and took it in, and of course this is illegal activity. The problem is that international law in many places around the world does not have local enforcement teeth. And the signatories to these conventions of international law, like the Geneva Conventions, are states, not individuals and not corporations. So it's very hard to enforce the ideas of international law on corporations. That's the challenge. Even Veolia, that French company, had spent 3 years in the French courts dealing with a similar suit against their operations in the settlements. And the French courts have also ruled that they don't see how they can make corporations abide by international law. It is the job of the state to make the corporations abide by international law, because the state is signatory to international law. So the next lawsuit is against the state of France, asking the state to enforce the law.
How about the gentleman in the green right here in the center?
Hello, yeah. You just mentioned that really short, and I don't know if it fits in the time frame or in the context right now, but I would like to know your opinion about the flotilla, because that was discussed pretty diversely in Germany, where I was at the time.
Thank you very much for this question. I left out so many good stories, so many amazing things that are happening now around Palestine as part of this global movement. The flotilla is one of them. The flotilla is just a code name. There is a series of actions called the Free Gaza Movement, trying to challenge the military siege of Gaza. And it is individuals and civil society from around the world that collect money and collect goods and buy ships and sail to Gaza. It's kind of crazy. I know that a few years ago, I think it was 7 years ago, I saw a piece of paper where somebody suggested this idea, and they were sending it around the room and collecting signatures for who wants to be involved in something like that. And I looked at that and I said, they're crazy. They are totally crazy. What do you mean you're going to sail to Gaza? What are you? I mean, I thought it was crazy. And I've seen some crazy. This was really crazy. But they did it. And they did it, I think, I don't remember the exact number of times, but 12, 13 times. And several times they managed to go into Gaza. In the last few times when they tried to get in, and especially the one 2 years ago when they had a whole flotilla of ships, the Israeli army decided not to let them in. And the flotilla became famous because the Israeli army took over the ships, and in one of the ships, the Mavi Marmara, they also killed 9 people, shot them and killed them. I think that apart from the loss of 9 lives, this was a huge victory. You know, when people go out to war in order to challenge a military blockade, they are sometimes killed. And it is in order to, because it's war. So I don't believe in war myself, I'm a pacifist. But in this case, this was a forgotten siege. The world forgot about it. The world didn't even think about it. This is a siege where Israel controls. For example, after the attack on Gaza in 2008, in the summer of 2008, Israel has attacked Gaza in order to try and free soldiers that was captured there. And they have killed 1,400 people, mostly civilians, by bombing them from the air into an area where people cannot run away. They are totally surrounded. It was not a military operation. It was butchery. Because there were 8 Israelis killed, mostly by Israeli fire. A huge destruction of life. And then, ever since then until today, Israel doesn't allow the Gazan to have any construction materials. The construction materials, in order to rebuild huge areas in Gaza that were destroyed, in order to rebuild some of the water systems or the electricity plants that was destroyed, the basic services for 1.5 million people who live there, they wouldn't send in those materials. So after the great publicity received, that the flotilla received, Israelis had to answer many questions. And they had to deal with international boards of inquiry that looked into the attack and looked into the attack on the flotilla. And they have lessened the terms of the siege. The siege is still in place, and it still needs to be lifted. But they had to publish the lists of what can go into Gaza and what cannot go into Gaza, and they had to change some of the terms of it. It was a huge victory. There was another similar action just recently. I don't know if people heard about it. It was called Welcome to Palestine. People were invited from all over the world to buy a flight ticket to go to Palestine. Now, in order to go to Palestine, there is no way to go to Palestine. If you want to go to the West Bank, you have to fly to Israel. You have to fly to Tel Aviv, and you have to go to the Israeli security and travel through Israel to go to Palestine. That's the only way. There is no airport in Palestine or in the West Bank. And usually the Israelis don't allow foreigners to come and visit the West Bank. So foreigners do come and visit the West Bank, but the way to do it usually is to lie. Is to say that you're going to visit family and friends in Israel, or that you are going to be a tourist in Israel. And then you go into the West Bank because there are no borders, not for tourists, not for Israelis. Only for Palestinians there are borders. For Israelis, they travel all around. This is highways. You don't see a border if you travel as an Israeli. If you're a Palestinian, you see a border every few seconds, because there are all these checkpoints and walls. So people usually lie when they come to Palestine. The idea of this action was not to lie. To come, hundreds of people on the same day, to arrive at the airport in Tel Aviv and to say, I'm going to visit the West Bank, because I want to see for myself. This was huge. Israel has stopped hundreds of people from getting on their planes, in the airports in Europe. They found out their names from their Facebook accounts, and they got the different airlines to tell them when they come to check into the flight, to tell them you cannot get on the flight because Israel will not let you in. And those of them that did manage to land in Israel were held in custody and then deported. They were not let in. So suddenly people understood that there is no Palestine, that you cannot go and visit Palestine. This is a huge success.
Yes, the woman in the yellow jacket right here.
Yes, I have two questions. One is, I think the most powerful way to stop occupation is try to convince the people in Israel. This is a direct way. It's not, I don't think through the international way is the best way. Probably the direct way to convince the people who live in Israel, this is the, we should not broken the international law to occupy other people's land. Do you try to convince your own people? And how many percentage of in Israel they support your idea? If this idea cannot accept by Israel people, then it's easily to know, to understand, because the decision maker, the president of Israel, he will do this decision, just occupy, just do the occupation. So I want to know how I'm not sure, do you have the right to broadcast your idea in Israel? And then if you can get the certain percentage of people who can support you, probably you can join the election and to be one of the decision maker and to influence the government position. I'm not sure if it's possible. possible? And then second question is religion organization, do they join to support your idea, and what's their religions organization? What about the idea? Thank you.
Thank you. I think I maybe put not enough stress in the first part of the talk, but of course, as an Israeli organization, our first and foremost duty is to influence Israeli public opinion. And we have been doing that for many years. Myself, not for so many years, but as a movement, ever since the beginning of the occupation. This is our job. And nobody else can do that. The situation in Israel in the last decade has been getting worse and worse in the way of public opinion. After the destruction of the peace negotiations, the general sentiment in Israel has become, and it was also part of the state propaganda, but it was very much accepted by the mainstream. It has become that of despair. The general feeling is of despair. People usually don't like the occupation. If you ask them in a poll about whether or not they want to stop the occupation and get rid of all the settlements, sometimes we get very good numbers. 60–70% would say yes. 60–70%. But then they go off to elections and they vote for the most right-wing nationalistic government in Israel's history, which is now in power. And when I try to understand how these two are compatible, I think the answer is despair. Because people don't see any vision ahead. And they have been told so many times that there are no alternatives. That the Palestinians, they would kill us all. That's all they want. They just want to kill us. And if they weren't all these walls and gates and fences, then they will come and kill us. They don't want peace, the Palestinians. They are born to kill. That's what the mainstream Israeli opinion is. I know this is my people. And it comes from a long history of thinking of our place in the world as victims, as part of Jewish history. It's very hard for Israelis to understand that they are an empire in the Middle East, that they have the strongest army in the whole area, that they control the lives of millions around them. And it's hard for Israelis to think of themselves as that. They still think of themselves as a persecuted minority. When I first went to some of these demonstrations, like many other Israeli activists, I had to go past that indoctrination. It's a huge crossover, because I knew everything in my head. I read everything. I knew, and I was an anti-occupation activist for years before I joined the Palestinian demonstration. Before I went on a Palestinian bus and went over to the Palestinian village and joined Palestinians in doing something or having tea. And I have to say that doing it for the first time includes a lot of fear, because I know that these are people just like me. But my upbringing and my education, I kept thinking they were going to kill me. And very quickly I found out that these were some of the most peace-loving people I've ever seen. These were farmers, especially the Gandhis that I've met there. Gandhis, I say, because they are like Gandhi in their way in the world. I was astonished. It's a kind of realization that comes from the heart, not from the head. And then it still goes. There are all these incidents on the way. When, for example, when we went with the kids to draw on the wall, remember that slide when the children are painting on the wall? So my role in this action was to speak with the soldiers. You cannot get in there without talking to the soldiers. So I speak the language. I am an Israeli, and I have the Israeli Jewish accent, so I can open doors with that accent because it's all based on ethnic privilege. So I could come with a paint and bring it in and bring some children from the village. And what I told the soldiers is, it's summer, the children are very, very bored. We are going to do some summer camp with the children who are inside the house. They are in prison, these children. We're going to play with them. And the soldier said, okay, as long as you don't touch the wall. I said, of course, no, touch the wall, that's... But another thing that the soldiers said when they first saw me was, what are you doing here? It's very dangerous. Because in their minds, the soldiers are there to protect me from these people, from these children. Because they are dangerous. So how can we influence Israeli public opinion? We have to create a vision for them of an alternative. We have to somehow help them cross the same psychological barrier and see Palestinians as fully human or as potential neighbors that should be treated with respect as neighbors. And we tried doing that. We tried bringing the images in. We tried, speaking. And of course, there are people in parliament also speaking out for the same. This is a very wide movement. But we have reached a stage where we think that there are too many economic interests involved in the continuation of this situation. We have reached a point where we think that the propaganda machine is much, much vaster than we can ever be, that the fear is much more powerful than the hope. And we have reached the point where we realize that most people know very well what is going on, do not like what is going on, but they still do not take a stand against what is going on because they stand to lose from any change, because they benefit from the current situation. It doesn't sound very nice, it's not very pretty, but it is the truth. And if you think about South Africa and apartheid, when people wanted to stop apartheid, of course, there were people who were trying to do that on the inside from the South African parliament. But can you really hope to get a majority of white votes against apartheid? Is this really what we need to do first? Because the whites, they will lose a lot of their economic privilege in South Africa. Of course, they should. And what about all the disenfranchised blacks in South Africa that don't get to vote for that parliament who controls their lives? There were all these puppet parliaments, yes, in the Bantustans, in the little autonomous zones where the blacks were forced to live. It's a very similar situation. If you think of Israel-Palestine as one land, and it is one land, and it is governed by one government today, and one state, the state of Israel, then there are 7 million Jews living there who vote for the parliament that controls this army, that controls this land. And they have many freedoms and liberties. And Israel considered itself to be a democracy because of that. But the same army in the same state also controls about 4 million Palestinians in the occupied territories that have no civil rights whatsoever. They are governed by a foreign military. That's not democracy. How come they don't get to vote on the future of their land? So in such a case, it is very important for the Israelis to stop enjoying this impunity, this huge impunity and continued direct and vast support from all around the world. It is time for civilized society around the world to tell the Israelis that's not okay. That's all we are saying. Give us the support from the outside in order to make the change from the inside. And this support means sending the message to Israel that this is not okay, that this is unacceptable, that this is not what democracy should look like, and that we as civil society do not have to continue and support it. We don't have to.
Okay, let's get someone from this side of the room here. How about the lady here with the, in the black right here, yeah.
My question is very light. Okay, the first question is, since the long-lasting conflict between the Palestine and Israel, religiously, culturally, material, psychologically, whatever you say. I want to explore more from a point of view, especially educationally, how these future generation, the teenagers, elementary school students, view this kind of conflict. And I want to know how your government teach the teenagers or university students, graduate students, these kind of conflicts. Is it good? Is it justice? I mean, for this teenager, how about the Palestinian school children? Do they go to school? How do the teacher teach them? And my second question is, from your point of view, do you think it is very promising for your future? I mean, this kind of peace between the two states, whatever. Yeah, these are my two questions.
Could you repeat the second question?
This question is from point of view, from your point of view. Do you think it is aggregating future, or do you think it's deteriorating, or do you think it is promising for the future to come someday in a due time? That the two states, I mean, the Palestine and Israel will go hand in hand and like brothers and sisters and sit together on the table.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As for the first question about education, one of the things that we have organized against as a feminist movement was the militarization of Israeli society. Israeli society is very highly militarized. We have universal conscription. It means that every Jew living in Israel has to go to the military at age 18. Men go for 3 years in the military service, and women for 2 years in military service, women and men. Palestinians who live inside Israel are exempt from going to the military. But that's also a form of discrimination, because later on they might find it harder to get a job, because many jobs states, they don't say no Palestinians, but they say only people who served in the military, which is a way to discriminate. In order to prepare an entire society to go to military service, and to go to military service in such places like you saw in the film, you know, to police civilians brutally, or to participate in wars of conquest in Lebanon and Gaza. This is not just a peaceful military, it's serious military duty. They have to start the education very early, and to normalize the idea of military and occupation and guns. I teach nonviolence in Israel, in Israeli academia, and also in the grassroots organizations. And my experience is that when I show images of guns to Israelis and to Palestinians, they have a very different reaction. Israelis are very comfortable with guns. We see them all around us. Everybody has guns. Everybody goes to the army. I've used a gun when I was a teenager. We went with our school, with our classroom, to some camp where we learned how to use guns, preparing us for our military duties. We were 14. And it's done all across the educational system. Palestinians who see a gun, they're very afraid of it, because guns are usually pointed at them. They don't have guns. And it's a very different reaction for people. And I first understood it also when I was first shot at. It was in a demonstration in the West Bank, and we were marching towards the checkpoint, and suddenly the soldiers in front of us started shooting at us. And I felt really offended. I'm serious. At first I wasn't afraid. I was just offended. That why are they shooting at me? This is personal. It's not nice. It's very impolite. And then I was also very afraid. But the idea of somebody shooting at me, I really grew up to never expect that, which is also a kind of crossing in my mind. So part of the education is always, when Israelis see these images of a soldier policing civilians with guns, sometimes a gun is pointed at a person's face. Many times the Israeli general public will look at this picture and not see what the normal person will see. They will see the soldier who is our boy, who is our friend, who is our protector. And they will see the Palestinian, who is, even a Palestinian child sometimes is viewed with suspicion, who is a terrorist. So they will say, oh yeah, it's not a nice picture because there is violence, but it's necessary. This is security. This is how people react to it. And it's very interesting to talk to them about their reaction. One of the things we try to do in the Coalition of Women for Peace is to reframe the language and the concept of security. What is security? People all the time say security. This is justified in the name of security, security. We ask them, what is security? Do you feel secure when you have soldiers all around you with guns who protect you from people who are not like you? What about job security? What about security from violence at home? What about security from violence in the street? What about health security? What about the kind of security where you know that you are safe from poverty? Okay, these are all sorts of human security. It is called human security. So we try to introduce this concept into the Israeli public because security is such an important value in the Israeli public. As for your second question about peace and how do I view things, I think that you cannot be an activist if you are not a little crazy optimistic. And you have to be a little crazy optimistic. Of course, I believe that peace is possible. I also believe that it is only possible in the framework of justice and equality and democracy and complete, full and equal rights to all the people who live on this land, this one land, Israel, Palestine. So it's not really a negotiation between two states. There are no two states. There is only one state here, the state of Israel. But there are many people who live on this land who are not represented by this present state configuration. So whatever happens, I know that we will reach a situation where people will demand their full and equal rights. And I know that there are enough creative forces on the land for people to come up with very imaginative solutions to how to govern their joint lives together. They can have 2 parliaments, they can have 5 parliaments, they can have cantons, they can have one state which is secular and democratic. I don't know. Some people have that around the world, it happens. It works in some places. They can have all sorts of different solutions as long as they are based on this principle of full civil rights, political rights, human rights to everybody equally. That's all. It's a lot to ask for. I truly believe it is possible. And I also think that we are getting closer to the time when change will be absolutely necessary. And that's our first stage, because right now, I think the state of Israel and most of its population believes that this situation is sustainable. What we have right now, this occupation, is sustainable. We can just continue managing it. But they are starting to realize that it is not sustainable. So change is inevitable. I do not think it will be very fast. I don't think that this is just around the corner. I think things will probably get much worse. I think that the current regime in Israel is showing us that they are willing to go to very, very extreme means in order to crush dissent, in order to get rid of the opposition. And now they're showing it with a series of new laws in the Israeli Knesset, Israeli parliament, trying to outlaw dissent. And in a way, it's cracking and destroying the facade of Israel as a democracy. I think we are going to see some hard times ahead of us.
May I?
Just a moment. We'll get to you in just 1 second. This gentleman was first. After him, certainly you. Yes, the gentleman in the green shirt up there. Go ahead.
In the beginning, how do you inspire the people around you or express the idea of peace and cooperation? Thank you.
I think that I should give that credit to the Palestinians. I'm here as a solidarity activist, not really, but mostly. The things that I've seen and learned from my Palestinian allies have transformed me and transformed people around me. The kind of movements that I've shown you here of these villagers who go out with their empty hands in front of the soldiers and welcome everybody to their houses. This is I think, where I learned everything I can learn about peace and hope for this land of ours. And this is also where I managed to at last get rid of my last fears about the ability of people to live together. I truly believe in that now, and it's all thanks to them. It's not something that I can inspire people to do, but I can show them. I can show them and I can invite them to see for themselves.
Yes, Lily, here.
Dr. Baum, I'm very appreciate that you, as an Israeli and Jewish, you can devote yourselves to assist and help Palestinians. But I'm also wondering, don't you have any personal conflict with your families and friends and colleagues and relatives? They may think Palestinians are enemies. So my second question is, I would like to know, what's your attitude towards suicide bombings in Israel? Even the female bombers, they kill so many your own people. So how could you keep going your effort to help them? Thank you very much indeed. Is this my questions?
Thank you. Suicide bombing was a tool of the second uprising. It was very prevalent in 2001 until 2003. There haven't been suicide bombings ever since. This is a tool that was actually not used anymore, and it is not used by decision. It's not because of this wall, by the way. The Israeli government always portrays the wall as what stopped suicide bombing. It is not true. There are about 30,000 Palestinians that cross into Israel every day to work as day laborers, illegally. They just cross the border in order to get wages and work inside Israel because of huge rates of unemployment in the occupied territories. So if somebody who wants to get a job can cross the lines and go into Israel in order to work, of course a terrorist who wants to blow something up can do that if they want to. So the fact that there have been no suicide bombings is because of a decision that took place. Of course, I abhor suicide bombers, and I abhor all forms of violence in this conflict. I mean, there are not just suicide bombings, there are also other militant attacks of missiles and using knives on people. The Israelis kill a lot more Palestinians, and they do it regularly. Many times this is obscured in the press. You can hear about the rockets coming out of Gaza, but you very rarely hear about the fact that there were also missiles and bombings going into Gaza. You should read it more carefully to see that both sides are shooting at each other. It's just that only one side has an army. There is no Palestinian army. There are all sorts of militias that use these homemade bombs. And this is what it looks like. I'm very much against all of it. I'm against my own training at age 14 to shoot a gun, because I've become a pacifist, totally. And I don't believe that violence can solve any problem. In fact, violence only creates more violence. So in a way, what changed is not my feelings towards suicide bombings. I was in Israel during the years of the suicide bombings, and people were blown up around me. I was terrified. Of course I am not in favor of suicide bombings. What changed was the idea of who is us and who is them. That is what's changed. On the one side, these are not Palestinians versus Israelis. On the one side are people who want to live with peace and security. And yes, security, even that word, but security for everybody. Also for the Palestinians. What about their security? What about their security when they live exposed to daily violence every day? They have to cross 2 checkpoints a day. What does it mean? You just stand there and watch, and you see what happens when a woman wants to cross a checkpoint because she's crossing the street. I can cross, nobody will ask me any word, but she's a Palestinian, so she has to show her papers to the soldier who should make sure that she has the right permit. And I just stand there, and the soldier drops her ID on the ground, so she has to bend down and pick it up. And then he takes it away from her, and he said, I will give it back to you only if you give me a kiss. In front of me. You give these young soldiers with guns so much power over people. This is violence. This is violence. What about their security? So the 2 sides are people who want to just go around their lives and have their basic dignity intact and be able to bring food home. And on the other side are the violent regimes and structures and systems. I don't think these are really people. These are systems without a face that operate and make people work for them. Like these soldiers, like these industrialists who build these factories in the territories and benefit from all these exploitations. Like these generals in power that the fear only keeps them in power. On both sides. On both sides. And therefore, my allies are not suicide bombers. They are people like me, but Palestinian.
Well, this certainly is a huge issue. Sadly, we only have time for one more question. So we'll take it from the middle row here. That gentleman in the black, turtleneck here. Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Baum, for taking my last questions. Thank you again for the lecture, which is very inspiring for all of us. My question is actually 2 questions. Excuse me. The first question is, do you view Israel's ultimate policy on West Bank as to eliminate all the Palestinians, or just to maintain the control or the tension, or anything, whatever, thus to grab some or maintain some foreign, some bargaining power within the international community, or when engaged in an international negotiation? And the second question is more general, mentioning security. Do you believe, as you mentioned, you are a pacifist, that there is a hit point, a balance point between human security and national security? Because we can see that all around the world, like Chechnya in Russia or the Basques in Spain, that they all exhibit similar news. Thank you very much.
As for the plan is very explicit, and you can see it in the maps. It's so explicit that it is actually even discussed openly. The official Israeli plan for how to manage the conflict is very clear. It is already on the ground. This was actually devised by Ariel Sharon, as you saw in the film. The plan is to help the Palestinians congregate into several small enclaves in the West Bank and have these enclaves to be self-managed by a local authority, the Palestinian Authority, and then control the Gaza Strip separately as an outside entity which is totally controlled on the outside. Maybe get the Palestinian Authority in power there too. So it's a kind of a puppet government that will control the Palestinians for us. But still, they can call it a Palestinian state. Maybe that's part of the plan, I don't know, because there is this call for a Palestinian state. But it will not be really a state. It's not contiguous, not just because of the separation between Gaza and the West Bank, but also because the West Bank itself is separated into at least 3 big blocks, and the main highways and so on are taken away. It's not contiguous. It has will never have any kind of power or outside borders. This is the plan. This is the plan. If they behave themselves, we'll let them have an airport, but no access, inside Israel. As I said, it's very similar to the Bantu stance of South Africa. You know, the fact that blacks couldn't vote in South Africa, so the South Africans said, the whites said they can vote in their Bantu stance, they are actually independent. And this is what makes it also different from other liberation struggles around the world. Because it's not just about the separate national identity of Palestinians, it's really not about that. It's about the basic human rights and basic civil rights of the Palestinians. Because they are totally disenfranchised. Even if they seem to be able to vote for some parliament, that parliament does not control anything. Anything. So I'm actually moving to your second question about human security. I'm, you know, it's funny to say that, but I'm a very strong believer in democracy. I really believe that people can come up with good ideas of how to govern their own lives, but you have to let them participate in the decision making. You cannot decide for them based on other people's ideas of what's good for them. That's a very basic idea of self-determination. That's a very basic idea. And this great crisis of 2000 was when people realized that this land will not be divided into two. It will not be divided first and foremost because of the settlements. The settlements are there, and they are probably there to stay. All of the peace negotiations afterwards were all about how Israel can keep the settlements in Israel and therefore annex more land from the West Bank. And you saw the map. You saw what that means. There are 500,000 settlers living in the West Bank. 500,000 people. It's a lot. It's a small country again. So if this land cannot be really divided into two, maybe it can be divided administratively, maybe it can be divided politically in some way. Maybe you can regain the idea of two national entities on one land in all sorts of different ways that have been tried around the world. But we're not moving to that direction. We're moving away from this direction and into apartheid. The word apartheid is more and more used in Israel-Palestine to describe the situation on the ground. When you have one land where people are governed differently based on their ethnicity, that there are different sets of laws applied to different groups of people based on their ethnicity. When you have two people next to each other getting arrested in one demonstration, me and my Palestinian friend, and I'm released the same day, and my Palestinian friend can stay in jail indefinitely. Indefinitely. They can be held without trial indefinitely. No rights. This is apartheid. And the word apartheid is also seeping into the Israeli public opinion now. We just had an op-ed last week published by the owner of one of the main liberal newspapers in Israel, Haaretz, who described how apartheid is the program. This is where the government is planning to take us. And how that means also the destruction of many of Israel's democratic institutions, such as the Supreme Court and the freedom of the press, because these institutions will, in the end, stand in the way of a truly apartheid, overt apartheid regime. So this is where we're heading. But we're heading that way because people don't see a way to separate it very clearly into two states. The other alternative, because we all know that apartheid is unsustainable. It can be sustained for a little bit, but I don't think the Palestinians will stop fighting. So the other way of dealing with the countries that cannot be separated is by sharing it and actually living together. And that's my vision. That's my hope for my country, that we can actually live together. I do believe this is possible, and I think our greatest challenge is to show it also to other Israelis, that it is possible.
Thank you, Dr. Dalit Baum. And thank you all for coming here this afternoon. If you would like to get more information about what her organization does, all of the information is in the pamphlet that you all have in front of you. Thanks again, Dr. Dali Baum, for a very insightful and passionate presentation, and thank you all for coming once again. Until the next time.
Thank you, both of you. Please give both of them a biggest applause. Thank you for coming, and see you in December 17th.